Hello guys, today we're going to be talking about assigning values into arrays. In my last video, we talked about strings and we talked about difference between variable initialization and variable assignment. So today we're going to be assigning values using variable initialization. So that's the first option that we need to know when assigning values. So let's say I'm trying to initialize an integer array. So I'm going to use int. So int, and the name of the array is going to be r, and I'm going to use this bracket to indicate that this is going to be an array variable. So it's not just a single variable, so it's going to be an array, and equal to, and we normally use this bracket. You can actually use this curly bracket, and I need to indicate the values I'm trying to assign. So let's say I'm trying to assign 23 and 56 and 9 and 4. So I'm going to close the bracket and I'm going to end up with semicolon because that's the end of the statement. So now here, if you take a look at the bracket, you see that I didn't put anything. I just open an empty bracket here. So this is an empty bracket. I didn't indicate the size. So this is actually valid. This is valid in C programming. So if you don't want to indicate the size, you can just leave it like this, and compiler is going to count the number of elements you're trying to assign, and then it's going to indicate the size for you. So you don't really need this, but if you want to, you want your array to have bigger size, so you want it to have more than the size of the element you're trying to assign. Let's say I'm trying to assign 4 values here, and then you want to have an array that's going to be like 20 size. So there's going to be more space for future purpose. Let's say you still want to assign values later in your program, then you can actually indicate the size. So but I'm just trying to let you know that this is valid. So if you don't indicate the size, it's still valid in C program. So let's say I'm trying to indicate a bigger size. So let's say I'm trying to put 20 here. So I'm trying to include 20 there. So which means this array now has 20 compartments that is going to take 20 different integer values. So here I've assigned it. So this is initialization. When you're trying to declare a variable and you are assigning values at the same time, this is valid. Then let's say I'm trying to use strings. So I'm trying to declare character array. So character array, let's say I'm trying to use 15 size, and also I can actually assign values like this using strings. Every time you use strings, you need to indicate double quotation because now we're talking about character. And in my previous video, I talked about when you're assigning single character, you use single quotation, and when you're assigning strings, which is combination of several characters, then you have to use double quotation. So let's say I'm trying to assign the word strings. This is valid. So during initialization, compiler is going to insert all this character inside here. So your array is going to look like this, because I talk about array that it has several compartments, and it's going to store the character one by one. So the first character is S, and the next one is going to be T, the next one is going to be R, just like that. But always make sure that when you deal with strings, there's always a string terminator, which means there's going to be an empty space at the end of that string, and that's how compiler know the end of the strings. So in my next video, I'm still going to talk about how do we know the size of an array. So we're going to be doing that later on. So here, this is valid. This is valid. You can actually assign values like this, and also you can also assign values like this. without bracket. So this work fine. So if you're dealing with um array and you're trying to assign strings, this is allowed. You can actually assign strings like this during initialization only. If it's not during initialization, you can't do that. For example, if I do something like this, first of all I try to declare an array and now I'm trying to assign values. So this is not going to work. So take a look at here. This is variable declaration. So here I try to declare the variable and later on I'm trying to assign values. So this is not going to work. It's not going to work. Even if it's an integer, array. So let's say I do something like this. I declare first, then I'm trying to assign values here. It's not going to work. So this is only valid during initialization. So the next one is using array indexing. So array index is when you open, let's say for example, now since we only allowed to assign values during initialization, then what if we want to declare an array and we want to assign later? So let's say for example I want to assign later on, so I don't want to assign during initialization. I want to open an array and then assign later. So here I'm trying to declare an array and now I need to assign later on. We can do that using index, the array index. And the meaning of that is we can just say this, we have to indicate the index. So let's say the first index. So in my last video I talked about array index where I said it always starts from 0. Let's say you have an array and array, they are next to each other. So since they are next to each other, we can actually use numbering system to access the values. So here let's say you have an array and this array is like this. So it's going to store the value like this. So let's say 1 2, let's say you're storing 4 here and here you're storing 5. So how do we know the index? Here we start from 0. So this is how we number them: 1 2 3. So if I'm saying 0, this means here. So if I'm saying 1, this means here. If I'm saying 2, this means here. So this is how we assign values using index. So here you can just say this equals to 6, then the next one 1 equals to 5. So just like that, this is going to work. So this is valid using array index. So the last option, we're going to be talking about that in my next video. I'm going to show you guys my VS Code and we're going to be running some program. So here I'm trying to include the library where we normally have the functions for printing values and scanning values. So this is the library, and these are main functions where we normally write all the statements, everything we want to do. So here this is called initialization. So here I'm trying to initialize, and initialization, when you're trying to assign at the same time you're trying to declare the variable, that's initialization. So here I'm trying to use a comment to just ignore this line. So I'm trying to ignore this line first because we're going to be trying that later. So I'm trying to ignore that, so the compiler is not going to touch here, and that's why I use this comment. So here this is just another integer array that I'm trying to initialize here, and I'm trying to assign these values in that array. So I'm going to run this code and we're going to see this is what we use, this format specifier that we normally use to print string, string character. So we use this to print strings. So if you want to print a single character, we've talked about that when I talk about print and specifier. So I'm going to run this code now and we're going to see. So now it works because I'm trying to assign value at the same time when I'm trying to declare this variable. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to declare the variable first and then I'm trying to assign. So I'm going to do that. This is declaration. So here I've declared this variable and here I'm trying to assign. And also, if you take note, the number of these letters, they're actually 7. And here I'm using 8 size because I have to leave an extra space for the terminator, and we've talked about that too. So that's why I'm using 8. So here I'm going to be trying this and let's see if it's going to work. So now we see that it throws an error because after declaration assignment is not allowed. This is just language rule about arrays. Once you've declared the array, you can't assign values directly. So I'm also going to indicate bracket here. So let's say I'm trying to use curly bracket here. So I'm trying to let you guys know that sometimes we use bracket just to make our code cleaner. So this bracket is still going to work. This is still going to work. So this bracket, it actually means the beginning. So compiler most times use this bracket to know the beginning and the end, and also it use this to know the beginning, this double quotation. It also use this to know the beginning and the end. So if you use double quotation, you don't really need to use bracket because they are still doing the same thing in this scenario. But if you use two of them, it's still going to work. So it's still going to work. So we use bracket most times when we're dealing with integer array. So example here, when we're trying to assign values, integer values, we don't use, double quotation. Double quotation is only for string. And if you're trying to assign integer value, we don't use double quotation. And we need to tell compiler the beginning of our values and the end. That's why we use bracket here. So we use bracket. This is going to tell the compiler that this is the beginning. And if we don't use this bracket, it's going to give an error because the compiler is not going to know the beginning and the end. So I'm going to show you guys now by running this code. So we see that it's giving error. So it's giving error because we did not include bracket, which compiler is going to use to know the beginning and the end of what we're trying to assign. So let's say we want to declare a variable first and later we want to assign values. So here, for example, I'm going to declare it. So this is our variable and now we're trying to assign values. So now we're trying to assign values. This is valid because we use array index. So this is just another option that I explained that we can actually use array index to assign values into our arrays. So this is valid. This is going to work and it's going to display this. So you see that it displays this and it tells me that the rest, like there's nothing in the rest, that means the rest are actually empty. But if you see the result here, I'm having another thing, so I'm going to explain. So now here, if you take note, you see that I assigned to character st. So now when I print the result, I'm getting another thing which is not normal. So if you check here, you see that I'm getting d, I'm getting m. So this is a proof to us that if you don't use string terminator, compiler does not stop reading. It's just going to continue reading. So each time you run the code, you're going to keep getting random values. These are stored somewhere else in the memory. And because compiler does not stop, it's going to keep giving me random values at the end. Let's say I try to indicate terminator now. So I'm going to do that. So let me use the third array. And now I'm going to indicate string terminator. From here you see that I keep having issues, having different letters coming up that I didn't even put, but here I've resolved that issue using string terminator. So this is string terminator. So I've explained that when I talk about string, when I say that compiler does not store the size of character array, it does not store the size. So you need to include string terminator, and that's why I was having that issue. So please subscribe, like this video, and I'm going to see you guys next video.